Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you haven't slept in 4 days, not because you can't, but because every time you close your eyes, something explodes close enough to shake the ground beneath you. Now, imagine it is -40. You are wearing a uniform that was designed for autumn. You haven't eaten a full meal in a week, and the person trying to kill you is somewhere in the building across the street. That was the reality for roughly 2 million soldiers, both Soviet and German, during the Battle of Stalingrad, which remains to this day the single deadliest battle in all of recorded human history, fought during one of the coldest and most punishing winters in living memory on the Russian steppe. If you are settling in for the night, this one is different from the others in this series. There is no ancient wisdom here, no generations of accumulated survival knowledge, just human beings thrown into conditions that nobody was prepared for, and finding ways to survive one more night. Subscribe and stick around, because how soldiers on both sides of the deadliest battle ever fought managed to sleep, eat, and stay alive at -40 in a city that had been reduced to rubble is one of the most extreme survival stories in recorded history. Stalingrad in the summer of 1942 was a busy, functioning Soviet industrial city of roughly 500,000 people, its factories producing tanks, artillery, and steel for the war effort. The city stretching nearly 40 kilometers in a long, narrow ribbon along the western bank of the wide and powerful Volga River. By late November of that year, when the massive Soviet counteroffensive Operation Uranus successfully encircled the entire German Sixth Army and the full brutal force of the Russian winter arrived simultaneously, the once thriving city had been systematically reduced by months of continuous bombardment and savage close quarters fighting to a blasted landscape that stunned survivors on both sides later compared to the barren, lifeless surface of the moon. Every single building of any size had been fought through systematically, floor by floor, room by room, sometimes wall by wall with pickaxes and grenades, and the accumulated rubble from collapsed structures and deliberately demolished buildings filled the streets and open spaces to depths of 2 or 3 meters in many places, creating a new landscape of destruction built on top of the original city streets. This rubble became the primary shelter for hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides, because the buildings that created it no longer existed, and there was nothing else. The winter of 1942 to 43 was unusually severe, even by Russian standards. Temperatures in the Stalingrad area dropped to -35. to -40 degrees Celsius in January. At -40 degrees, exposed skin begins to freeze within minutes of contact with the open air. Bare metal burns on contact with skin as severely as a hot surface would. Precision weapons jam as lubricants turn to thick paste. Vehicle engines seize solid as oil freezes in the block, and the human body rapidly begins losing its ability to think clearly and make rational survival decisions, as the early stages of hypothermia quietly set in. And in this cold, soldiers had to sleep, because a human being who doesn't sleep eventually stops functioning entirely, and a soldier who can't function is a dead soldier. The Soviet soldiers at Stalingrad had one critical advantage in the cold. They were Russians, and the Russian military had centuries of experience fighting in extreme winter conditions. The standard Soviet winter uniform that was issued when supplies allowed included the Telegraika, a quilted padded jacket filled with layers of cotton, wadding stitched into channels. The Valenki, thick seamless, felt boots made from compressed sheep's wool, and the Ushanka, the iconic fur-lined hat with fold-down ear flaps that has since become the worldwide symbol of Russian winter endurance. The Telegraika was crude but effective. Multiple layers of cotton fabric quilted together with cotton batting trapped dead air in a pattern that provided reasonable insulation down to about -20. Below -20, the Telegraika alone wasn't sufficient, and soldiers supplemented it with anything they could find: captured German blankets, strips of cloth wound around the torso, newspaper stuffed inside the jacket. The Valenki felt boots made from compressed wool were the single most important piece of Soviet winter equipment, and soldiers who lost theirs often lost their feet to frostbite within hours. Felt is one of the oldest insulating materials in human existence, the same material used in Mongolian jurs, and Valenki provided thermal protection that leather or rubber boots couldn't match at extreme temperatures. The problem was supply. There were never enough Valenki for every soldier at Stalingrad, and the allocation of winter boots became a life-or-death logistics decision made by officers, who knew that every pair they couldn't provide meant potential amputations. Soviet soldiers at Stalingrad slept in whatever shelter they could find or create, and the hierarchy of shelter quality determined who lived and who froze. The best available shelter anywhere in the destroyed city was an intact basement beneath a building that still had enough of its upper structure remaining to provide overhead protection, and control of these precious basements was fought over with ferocity and desperation, every bit as intense as the fighting for officially designated strategic positions. Because possession of a sheltered basement literally meant the difference between sleeping at a survivable -5 degrees and sleeping at a potentially lethal -40 in the open wind. An intact basement with its entrance blocked or covered could maintain an interior temperature 20 to 30 degrees warmer than the outside air. The thermal mass of the surrounding earth and the insulation of the rubble above creating a natural bunker. Soldiers packed into these basements with as many bodies as the space could hold, not for comfort but for survival, each additional body raising the temperature by a measurable fraction of a degree. The next best option was a dugout, a hole carved into the frozen earth or into the side of a rubble pile, covered with whatever material was available. Timber, sheet metal, doors ripped from buildings. Digging into frozen ground at Stalingrad required extraordinary effort. The soil was frozen solid to a depth of over a meter, and soldiers used bayonets, helmets, and bare hands when entrenching tools weren't available. A well-constructed dugout covered with rubble and a tarp could maintain an interior temperature of -10 to -15. Still brutally cold, but survivable with proper clothing and body heat. The worst option, and the one many soldiers faced nightly, was sleeping in the open among the rubble with no overhead cover, relying entirely on clothing and companions for warmth. The fire situation at Stalingrad was uniquely and cruelly paradoxical in a way that no other cold survival culture has ever faced, because fire was simultaneously salvation and potential death sentence in the most literal possible sense. A warming fire built in a basement or dugout could absolutely save your life from freezing to death overnight. But the visible smoke rising from your position during the day or the flickering light escaping through gaps in the rubble at night could draw precisely aimed enemy mortar, sniper, or artillery fire that would end your life just as certainly as the cold would have. Soviet soldiers learned to build small smokeless fires using techniques that would later be formalized in military survival training, burning only the driest wood in small quantities that produced heat with minimal, visible smoke. In basements, fires were built in improvised stoves made from punctured oil drums or ammunition boxes, with chimneys fashioned from pipe salvage from the destroyed buildings, directing smoke away from the shelter entrance. The fuel was whatever burned: broken furniture, window frames, floorboards, books, wooden rifle stocks from broken weapons, even the leather from destroyed equipment when nothing else was available. German soldiers faced a more acute fuel crisis because the encirclement cut their supply lines, and the Luftwaffe airdrops that were supposed to sustain 300,000 trapped men delivered a fraction of what was needed. By December 1942, German soldiers in the Stalingrad pocket were receiving roughly 1/6 of the minimum daily caloric requirement, and without calories, the body cannot produce heat. The German Sixth Army's cold crisis was catastrophically worse than the Soviet one, and the reasons reveal how preparation and equipment determine survival more than individual toughness. The German Army's high command had planned with absolute confidence for a quick, decisive summer victory that would end the Eastern Campaign before the first snowfall. And as a direct consequence of this catastrophic planning failure, had not issued proper winter uniforms to the vast majority of units deployed at Stalingrad, meaning that soldiers were still wearing the same lightweight autumn uniforms they'd arrived in months earlier, when temperatures were 30 or 40 degrees warmer. German leather boots, excellent for European autumn, became instruments of torture in Russian winter. Leather conducts cold efficiently and stiffens. When frozen, constricting circulation to the feet at exactly the moment blood flow was most needed. Frostbite casualties among German soldiers at Stalingrad reached staggering and, historically, unprecedented numbers. Tens of thousands of men lost toes, feet, fingers, and in severe cases entire hands and lower legs to cold injury that properly designed and properly supplied winter footwear and insulated clothing could have entirely prevented, each amputation representing a leadership failure as much as a medical emergency. The German wool greatcoat, while better than nothing, was designed for temperatures down to about -10. In -40, it provided roughly the same thermal protection as a bedsheet. German soldiers, with increasing desperation, stripped winter clothing from dead Soviet soldiers wherever they found them, wrap themselves in curtains and carpet, scavenge from the ruins of destroyed apartments and offices, and stuffed crumpled newspaper and cardboard into their leather boots and between the layers of their inadequate uniforms, employing the same improvised insulation techniques that Soviet soldiers also used, but beginning from a starting point of significantly worse baseline equipment that made even the best improvisation barely adequate. The psychological impact of being underdressed in extreme cold cannot be overstated. The constant physical misery erodes morale, impairs judgment, and creates a downward spiral where cold leads to bad decisions that lead to colder conditions. Sleep at Stalingrad was never the continuous rest that the body needs. It was snatched in fragments between combat, guard duty, and the constant management of cold. Soldiers on both sides of the front reported sleeping in desperately short fragmented periods, lasting anywhere from 20 minutes to 2 hours at most. The constant fragmentation of rest driven by mandatory guard rotation schedules that couldn't be skipped. The unpredictable interruption of artillery bombardment that could arrive at any moment from any direction, and the essential ongoing need to maintain whatever fire was keeping the group alive and to regularly check their own and their companions' extremities for the early warning signs of potentially crippling frostbite. The human body can function on fragmented sleep for a remarkably long time, but the cognitive impairment accumulates, and after several days of severely fragmented sleep, soldiers reported hallucinations, emotional numbness, and an inability to process simple information. Medical officers on both sides noted that the most common cause of death among soldiers who were not directly killed by enemy action was the combination of cold, exhaustion, and malnutrition, the three conditions reinforcing each other in a lethal spiral. The body's response to simultaneous cold and sleep deprivation is particularly dangerous because both conditions impair the same regulatory systems, and the combination is more lethal than either alone. Hypothermia impairs judgment, making the person less likely to take the actions needed to warm up, while sleep deprivation impairs the shivering response that generates emergency heat, each condition disabling the body's defense against the other. Soldiers on both sides of the front learn through hard and often tragic experience to constantly watch each other with vigilant attention for the telltale warning signs of this lethal physiological combination. The specific pattern where a person who has been visibly shivering for hours suddenly and ominously stops shivering, stops complaining about the cold that has been tormenting everyone equally, and instead becomes unnaturally drowsy, confused, and paradoxically calm, is a person in immediate and urgent danger of dying within the next 30 to 60 minutes, unless aggressively rewarmed. The social dimension of sleeping at Stalingrad was critical, just as it has been in every cold survival situation we've examined, but with a unique military dimension. Soldiers slept in groups of 3 to 5, pressed together as tightly as possible, rotating positions so that the person on the outside, the coldest position, would move to the center after a set period. This rotation system was informal, but strictly observed, because the difference between the center and the edge of a sleeping group at -40 could be the difference between waking up and not waking up. The shared body heat of 5 soldiers in contact generates roughly 400 watts, the same output as a small heater, and in a confined space like a basement or dugout, this heat was the primary survival mechanism. Officers on both sides who initially attempted to maintain proper military formality and appropriate sleeping distance between ranks quickly learned through painful experience that the extreme cold enforced its own unwritten regulations that superseded any military code. Formal distinctions of rank and hierarchy simply disappeared entirely when raw physical survival required the intimate physical contact of bodies pressed together for shared warmth. German soldiers whose military culture emphasized strict hierarchy found the transition to survival-driven physical closeness psychologically difficult, in ways that Soviet soldiers whose collective culture was more comfortable with close contact did not. If you are drifting off right now, that is perfectly fine. These mysteries will still be here waiting when you wake up. The food situation at Stalingrad directly affected cold survival because the body cannot produce heat without caloric fuel, and both armies were operating on rations far below what the cold demanded. A soldier at rest in -40 conditions with adequate clothing needs approximately 4,000 to 5,000 calories per Dalton Y just to maintain safe core body temperature through metabolic heat production alone, and the intense physical demands of active combat, digging, carrying equipment, running between positions under fire, increases this caloric requirement to 6,000 calories or more per Dalton Y, a volume of food that no army at Stalingrad was able to consistently deliver. Soviet soldiers defending Stalingrad were receiving roughly 1,500 to 2,000 calories per Dalton Y during the periods when supply lines across or along the Volga functioned. Normally, which was significantly less than half the estimated 4,000 to 5,000 calorie cold weather minimum, and their bodies had no choice but to consume their own muscle tissue and fat reserves to make up the enormous caloric difference required to maintain core body temperature. German soldiers trapped inside the pocket after the Soviet encirclement received as little as 300 to 700 calories per Dalton Y from the Luftwaffe airlift that was supposed to sustain them. A ration so far below starvation level that maintaining any meaningful thermoregulation became physiologically impossible for the human body, regardless of how much clothing was worn or how good the available shelter might have been, because without caloric fuel, the metabolic furnace simply cannot produce enough heat to maintain core temperature. The famous Narkom Payok 100 grams of vodka, the daily alcohol ration officially issued to Soviet frontline soldiers, served a thermal function that military doctors understood was far more psychological than genuinely physiological. Because alcohol actually accelerates dangerous heat loss from the body's core by dilating peripheral blood vessels and sending warm blood rushing to the skin surface. But the powerful subjective perception of internal warmth that the vodka created sustained morale and fighting spirit at a moment when both were dangerously close to collapse. Soviet military doctors debated the vodka ration throughout the war. The warmth it provided was illusory. The morale it provided was real. And in a situation where psychological collapse was as dangerous as hypothermia, the morale benefit won the argument. Hot food was the most effective thermal intervention available, and Soviet field kitchens positioned as close to the front as possible delivered kasha, hot porridge made from buckwheat, that served the same thermal function as Mongolian salt tea or Tibetan butter tea. Getting hot food to frontline soldiers was itself a deadly mission. The carriers who ran hot food from field kitchens to forward positions under fire were performing one of the most dangerous supply roles in the battle. The medical situation at Stalingrad was a cold survival crisis of its own, because wounded soldiers faced a thermal emergency on top of their physical injuries. A wounded soldier who couldn't move to maintain circulation, couldn't tend a fire, and couldn't huddle with companions was in extreme danger of freezing to death before medical help arrived. Soviet medical officers reported that soldiers with relatively minor wounds died of hypothermia while waiting for evacuation across the frozen Volga, the cold-killing men whose injuries alone would have been survivable. Blood loss accelerated cold death dramatically. Every liter of blood lost reduced the body's ability to circulate warmth, and in winter conditions, a bleeding wound was a thermal emergency as much as a surgical one. The Soviet medical evacuation across the frozen Volga was one of the most harrowing operations of the entire battle. Wounded soldiers were dragged on sleds across the ice under German bombardment. The crossing took roughly 45 minutes in good conditions, and at -40 with wind on the exposed river ice, an immobilized wounded soldier could lose consciousness from cold within 20 minutes. Medical personnel wrapped the wounded in every available layer and packed them between other bodies on the sleds. The same body heat sharing principle that kept the healthy alive now applied to the dying. The psychological coping mechanisms that soldiers developed for cold weather sleeping at Stalingrad reveal the human mind's capacity to adapt to conditions that seem unendurable. Soldiers reported that after the first week of extreme cold, a kind of emotional numbness set in that was actually protective. The constant misery became background noise that the mind learned to partially tune out. This numbness is a documented psychological response to sustained extreme stress called emotional blunting, the brain reducing its response to constant negative stimuli to preserve cognitive function for essential survival tasks. Soviet soldiers relied heavily on their characteristic dark humor as an essential psychological coping mechanism throughout the winter. Bitter jokes about the extreme cold, the terrible food, and the impossible conditions became a form of collective psychological resistance against despair, transforming individually unbearable reality into a shared experience that could be communicated, acknowledged, and even briefly laughed at together around the fire. Letters home from soldiers on both sides contain remarkably similar descriptions of cold. The language of cold suffering appears to be universal. The same words, the same complaints, the same longing for warmth, regardless of uniform. German soldiers wrote about dreaming of warm rooms, of their mother's kitchen, of summer days, the cold invading their sleep so thoroughly that even dreams were colored by it, warmth becoming the primary content of the unconscious mind. Soviet soldiers wrote similar things in their letters: home, warmth, food, the cold stripping away ideology and identity, until what remained was simply a human body longing for heat and rest. The sewer system beneath Stalingrad played a critical and rarely discussed role in cold weather survival, providing underground passages that maintained above freezing temperatures. Soviet soldiers used the sewer tunnels for both movement and shelter. The underground temperature remained a relatively stable -5 to 0 degrees, even when the surface was -40. A 40-degree temperature advantage may not sound like shelter, but in survival terms, the difference between -40 and 0 is the difference between lethal exposure and uncomfortable, but survivable conditions. The factory basements of the Stalingrad Industrial District, particularly the Barricade, Red October, and Stalingrad Tractory complexes, provided the largest and most stable underground shelters. These massive industrial basements could shelter hundreds of soldiers simultaneously, and the combined body heat of the occupants raised interior temperatures to levels where sleeping was possible without the imminent threat of freezing to death. The fighting for control of these factory complexes was among the most intense of the entire battle, and the thermal value of the basements was as much a motivation as their tactical significance. Soldiers who controlled a factory basement and soldiers who were exposed on the surface were fighting the same battle, but experiencing completely different wars. The sheltered soldier might survive the winter. The exposed soldier almost certainly wouldn't. Still, with us, we're already somewhere in that space between waking and dreaming. Either way, there is more to explore. The Volga River itself played a unique role in the cold survival story, because the frozen river was both a supply line and a killing ground. When the Volga froze solid in November, it transformed from an impassable barrier that isolated the Soviet defenders into an ice road that could support vehicles, dramatically improving supply delivery. Supplies that had previously been ferried across under fire in boats could now be driven across on the ice, and the increased supply flow brought more winter clothing, food, fuel, and ammunition to the Soviet defenders. But the frozen Volga was also a killing ground. German artillery and air attacks targeted the crossing points, and the flat exposed ice offered no cover. Every supply run was a gamble with lives. The sniper warfare that characterized much of the Stalingrad battle had its own relationship with cold, because snipers had to remain motionless for hours in temperatures that made stillness potentially lethal. Soviet snipers at Stalingrad, including the famous Vasily Zaitsev, lay motionless for hours in positions where wind chill could push effective temperatures below -50. The sniper's challenge was uniquely cruel. Any movement to generate warmth could reveal the position, but remaining still for too long meant frostbite, hypothermia, and eventually the inability to pull the trigger. Snipers developed techniques for isometric muscle contractions, tensing and releasing muscle groups without visible movement, generating small amounts of metabolic heat while maintaining the stillness their craft required. The relationship between cold and weapons reliability was another dimension of the survival challenge, because weapons designed for temperate climates malfunctioned catastrophically in extreme cold. German weapons were particularly affected. Their tighter machining tolerances meant that oil thickened by cold caused jamming more frequently than the Soviet weapons, which were deliberately designed with looser tolerances for extreme conditions. Soldiers on both sides learned to keep weapons close to their bodies during sleep, sometimes sleeping with rifles inside their clothing, using body heat to prevent the mechanisms from freezing solid. Sleeping with a weapon against your body for thermal reasons created a grim intimacy between soldier and rifle. The same object designed to kill was now essential for personal heat retention. The German surrender on February 2, 1943 ended the battle, but not the cold survival crisis, because the roughly 91,000 German prisoners now faced the Soviet prisoner of war system in the middle of winter. Of the roughly 91,000 German soldiers who surrendered at Stalingrad on or after February 2, 1943, fewer than 6,000, barely more than 6%, ultimately survived the brutal years of Soviet captivity and eventually returned home to Germany. The overwhelming majority having died of continued cold exposure, epidemic disease including typhus and dysentery, and severe systematic starvation in the prisoner, of war camps during the months and years that followed the battle's end. The long forced march from the surrender point to distant prisoner of war camps across the frozen Russian landscape killed additional thousands of already devastated men, soldiers whose bodies had been systematically weakened by months of cumulative starvation, constant combat stress, untreated wounds, and relentless cold exposure. Simply collapsed on the road one by one, fell face down in the snow, and froze to death where they fell, their bodies sometimes not recovered until the spring thaw months later. Soviet soldiers who survived the battle faced their own ongoing cold challenge as they pursued the retreating German army westward through the winter of '43, fighting and freezing across hundreds of kilometers. The battle ended, but the winter didn't, and the soldiers who survived Stalingrad still had months of frozen fighting ahead of them. Soldiers on both sides carried personal items that served psychological survival functions during the coldest nights, and the objects found in Stalingrad's soil decades later tell a story of what mattered most when everything else was stripped away. Photographs of families were the most commonly carried personal item, and soldiers reported that looking at the photograph of a wife or child during the worst moments of cold provided a psychological anchor that physical warmth could not match. Letters from home were read and reread until they fell apart, and soldiers who received mail showed measurably better morale and survival rates than those who didn't. The psychological warmth of connection translating into actual physical resilience. German soldiers carried bread bags, small cloth sacks that held their ration, and in the final weeks of the pocket these bags were often empty. But soldiers kept them, the habit of preparation persisting even when there was nothing to prepare for. Soviet soldiers carried the Makorka tobacco that was issued as part of their ration, and smoking served both social and thermal functions, the small fire of the cigarette providing a focus for attention during the most miserable hours. The act of cupping hands around a lit cigarette in -40 provided a tiny but real source of warmth to the fingers, and the communal sharing of tobacco created social bonds that strengthened the cooperative survival behaviors. Religious items, icons for the Soviet soldiers who still practiced, despite official atheism, and crosses and prayer books for the German soldiers, were carried with a frequency that suggests desperation pushed many toward faith who might not have otherwise turned to it. The engineering adaptations that soldiers improvised at Stalingrad deserve attention because they represent a compressed version of the architectural evolution that other cultures developed over centuries. Soviet combat engineers, drawing on institutional knowledge of winter warfare that stretched back through generations of fighting in Russian conditions, developed and refined a practical technique of using small-shaped explosive charges to blast through the iron-hard frozen ground, creating usable dugout shelters in mere minutes that would have taken exhausted, malnourished soldiers working with hand tools days or even weeks to dig, and these quickly created blast shelters directly saved thousands of lives during the worst of the winter fighting. The walls of these blasted dugouts were lined with whatever insulating material was available, layers of clothing stripped from the dead, carpets pulled from destroyed apartments, even stacks of frozen newspapers that provided surprising insulation. Intact stovepipes quickly became the single most valuable and desperately sought after salvage item in the entire ruined city, more valuable pound for pound than ammunition or food in some circumstances, because a single recovered length of intact metal pipe meant the critical ability to safely vent toxic smoke and carbon monoxide from an underground shelter or basement, transforming what would otherwise be a dangerous suffocation hazard into a safe and sustainable heating system that could burn fuel continuously through the night without killing its occupants. Soviet soldiers built what they called zemlyankas, semi-underground bunkers with log roofs covered in earth, and the best-constructed zemlyankas could maintain interior temperatures above freezing, even at -40 outside. The design principle was identical to every other subterranean shelter strategy in human history: use the Earth's thermal mass as insulation and bury the living space below the worst of the wind and cold. The most sophisticated zemlyankas included ventilation systems, sleeping platforms raised off the cold ground, and drainage channels for snowmelt, engineering solutions reinvented under fire that permanent cultures had developed over centuries. German soldiers lacked the engineering tradition and the tools to build equivalent shelters, another institutional preparation gap that translated directly into differential survival rates between the two armies. The water situation in freezing conditions created its own survival challenge. because dehydration in extreme cold is as dangerous as it is in extreme heat. Cold air holds almost no moisture, and every breath exhaled carries water vapor from the lungs, the same respiratory dehydration that affects Tibetan monks and Bedouin in dry environments. Melting snow for drinking water required fuel that was already scarce, and eating snow directly lowered core body temperature dangerously, each mouthful of snow requiring the body to expend precious calories to melt and warm it internally. Soldiers learned to carry water bottles inside their clothing, using body heat to keep the water liquid, the same technique that every cold climate culture discovered independently. The irony of freezing to death while surrounded by one of the world's great rivers was not lost on the soldiers. The Volga carried more than enough water, but in winter, it was all solid ice. The total human cost of the Battle of Stalingrad, combining direct combat deaths from both sides, the enormous number of cold weather casualties and frostbite amputations, deaths from starvation and malnutrition, related organ failure, epidemic disease losses, the subsequent mass deaths among German prisoners of war, and the uncounted civilian casualties among the trapped population exceeded 1.5 million human lives lost in roughly 5 months of continuous fighting and freezing. Of that number, cold was a direct or contributing cause in hundreds of thousands of deaths, making the winter of Stalingrad one of the deadliest cold weather events in human history. The lessons that military organizations drew from Stalingrad's cold weather casualties permanently changed how armies prepare for winter warfare. The first lesson was that winter clothing is not optional equipment. It is a weapon system, and an army without proper winter gear is as disarmed as an army without ammunition. Modern NATO and Russian military winter doctrine both emphasize layered clothing systems, high-calorie rations, insulated shelter systems, and cold weather training as essential combat preparations, rather than comfort items. The second lesson was that caloric intake in cold conditions must be dramatically increased. Modern military cold weather rations provide 4,000 to 5,000 calories per Dalton Y, roughly double the standard temperate weather ration. The third lesson was about sleep management. Modern military doctrine recognizes that sleep-deprived soldiers make fatal errors, and cold weather operations now include mandatory rest rotations, even in combat. Every one of these lessons cost lives to learn, and the doctrine manuals that now protect soldiers from cold weather casualties are written in the invisible ink of Stalingrad's dead. Stalingrad represents the darkest version of the cold survival story we've been exploring in this series, because unlike every other culture we've examined, the soldiers at Stalingrad were not adapted to their conditions. Mongolian nomads had 3,000 years of accumulated cold knowledge. Aboriginal Australians had 65,000. Tibetan monks had 1,000. Bedouin families had 4,000. The soldiers at Stalingrad had weeks. The knowledge they developed was compressed from the generations that other cultures had into a brutally accelerated survival course, where the final exam was death. And yet the techniques they independently discovered, body heat sharing, underground shelter, small efficient fires, high-calorie hot food, rotation sleeping, these are the same techniques that every cold climate culture on Earth developed over centuries and millennia. The human instinct for cold survival runs deep enough that soldiers with no training rediscovered in weeks what took other cultures thousands of years to refine. The knowledge is in us somewhere, waiting. Your heating system tonight works because millions of people across history paid the price of cold with their bodies. The knowledge embedded in your thermostat traces back through engineering and science to the basic human discoveries about warmth that Stalingrad soldiers rediscovered the hard way. Stalingrad's geography was uniquely cruel for cold survival. The city stretched 40 kilometers along the Volga, but was only a few kilometers deep, meaning Soviet defenders were pressed against the river, with no room to retreat into warm rear areas. Soviet soldiers at the narrowest point held a strip of city, less than 300 meters deep, close enough that German soldiers could sometimes see the Volga, and in that narrow strip there was almost no protected rear area for sleeping or warming. The western bank of the Volga, where the battle raged, was lower than the eastern bank, and the cold wind funneled down the river channel and swept across the Soviet positions with nothing to break it. The eastern bank, where Soviet reinforcements and supplies staged, was marginally warmer because the bluffs and buildings on the western bank provided some wind shadow, and wounded soldiers evacuated east crossed into slightly less extreme conditions. The grain elevator, the main railway station, Mamayev-Kurgan Hill, and the factory complexes became the fixed points around which the cold survival geography organized itself. each one offering specific shelter advantages. Mamayev Kurgan, the central hill that dominated the city, changed hands over a dozen times during the battle, and control of its slopes meant access to the tunnels and dugouts carved into its sides. The soldiers who held the summit of Mamayev Kurgan were the most exposed to wind and cold, and the hilltop positions were among the most thermally dangerous in the entire battle, the tactical advantage coming at a severe survival cost. The night sounds of Stalingrad in winter formed a unique acoustic environment that affected both sleep and psychological survival. Artillery fired throughout the night on both sides, and soldiers learned to distinguish by sound which caliber was being fired, how far away it was, and whether it was incoming or outgoing, this knowledge determining whether they could continue sleeping. Soldiers reported that they could sleep through their own artillery firing because the sound meant safety, but would wake instantly at the specific whistle of incoming fire, the brain's threat detection system remaining active even during fragmented sleep. The cold itself made sounds, metal contracting with sharp cracks, ice shifting on the Volga with deep groaning sounds, the wind moaning through destroyed buildings like a voice. The human sounds were worse, wounded men calling out in the dark in 2 languages, and the universal sound of misery that needed no translation across the front line. Soviet soldiers sometimes heard German soldiers singing Christmas carols in December 1942, the sound carrying across the frozen rubble from enemy positions, and the shared humanity of the music in those conditions affected men on both sides. The role of political officers, the commissars, in Soviet cold survival was complex. They enforced discipline that sometimes saved lives and sometimes cost them. Commissars ensured that shelter and food distribution remained organized even when military discipline was breaking down under the pressure of cold and combat, preventing the everyman for himself collapse that would have been lethal. But they also enforced orders to hold positions that were thermally untenable. Soldiers who retreated from exposed positions to seek warmer shelter without authorization could be shot. The cold regulations enforced with bullets. Order 22-7, Stalin's famous not one step back directive, meant that the option of retreating to better shelter simply didn't exist for Soviet soldiers. You held your position or you died, by cold or by firing squad. German discipline broke down more completely as the encirclement tightened and conditions worsened, and the loss of organizational structure accelerated cold casualties. When military organization fails in extreme cold, the cooperative survival behaviors, fire sharing, sleep rotation, food distribution, collapse with it, and individual soldiers left to survive alone. In -40, almost never do. The horses at Stalingrad experienced their own cold survival crisis that directly affected the soldiers who depended on them. Both the German Wehrmacht and the Soviet Red Army relied extensively on horses for transport, artillery towing, and general logistics support throughout the battle, and the extreme winter cold killed these essential animals at an even faster and more devastating rate than it killed the soldiers who depended on them. The horses and mules lacking the human ability to actively seek improved shelter, build warming fires, or communicate their deteriorating condition to those responsible for their care. Dead horses became a food source for starving soldiers on both sides, and in the worst period of the German encirclement, horse meat was the primary protein available. The frozen horse carcasses also served as windbreaks and thermal barriers. Soldiers positioned dead animals to block wind from sleeping areas, the bodies providing shelter in death that they'd provided transport in life. Rats thrived in the basements and sewers where soldiers sheltered, feeding on food scraps and the dead, and soldiers reported rats crawling over them during sleep, seeking warmth from human body heat. The rats carried disease, and the outbreaks of typhus and dysentery that killed thousands of soldiers on both sides were directly connected to the crowded, unsanitary conditions of cold weather sheltering. The cruel irony was that the behaviors necessary for cold survival, crowding together, sharing confined spaces, sleeping in contact with others, were also the behaviors that maximized disease transmission. The experience of the Soviet female soldiers at Stalingrad adds another dimension to the cold survival story, because over 1,000 women served in combat roles during the battle. Soviet women served as snipers, medics, communications operators, and anti-aircraft gunners, facing the same cold as their male counterparts, but with uniforms that were designed for men and often fit poorly. Ill-fitting boots were the most dangerous equipment problem for female soldiers. Boots sized for men allowed cold air to circulate inside rather than trapping warm air. increasing frostbite risk. Female medics who crawled across open ground to retrieve wounded soldiers under fire did so in the same -40 conditions as everyone else, with the additional physical burden of dragging men who often weighed twice what they did. The sleeping arrangements for mixed-gender units were managed with typical Soviet practicality. Survival overrode propriety, and women slept in the same huddles as men when the cold demanded it. Female snipers faced the same motionless cold exposure challenge as their male counterparts, lying still for hours in freezing positions, and the Soviet sniper training program included specific cold weather endurance conditioning. The civilian population still trapped in Stalingrad during the winter experienced the cold crisis with even fewer resources than the soldiers. An estimated 10 to 50,000 civilians, the wide range reflecting the chaos that made accurate counting impossible, remained trapped in the city throughout the entire winter battle, unable or unwilling to evacuate, hiding in basements, partially collapsed ruins, and the sewer tunnel network beneath the destroyed streets, surviving on whatever scraps of food they could scavenge from the wreckage of what had been their homes and neighborhoods. These civilians had no military winter clothing, no organized rations, and no systematic shelter. They survived through the same ancient human instincts that every cold climate culture has relied on: fire, shared warmth, and underground shelter. Women and children huddled in basements that sometimes sheltered both Soviet soldiers and civilians. The military and civilian survival needs temporarily merging in shared underground spaces. Some soldiers shared their meager rations with the civilians. Others took what the civilians had. The breakdown of social order under extreme survival pressure, revealing the full spectrum of human behavior. The children who survived the winter of Stalingrad carry memories that they've described in interviews decades later, and the recurring theme is the cold more than the explosions, more than the hunger. The cold dominates every account. The propaganda on both sides used the cold as a narrative weapon, and the way cold was framed psychologically affected how soldiers experienced it. Soviet propaganda deliberately and effectively framed the extreme cold as a powerful military ally, invoking the legendary figure of General Winter, who had famously fought alongside Russia's defenders against Napoleon's invasion over a century earlier. And this carefully crafted narrative framing gave Soviet soldiers a genuine and measurable psychological advantage in enduring the same temperatures that demoralized their German counterparts. Because in the Soviet mind, the bitter cold was fighting on their side. It was the land itself rising up to punish the foreign invader who had dared to set foot on Russian soil. German propaganda had no equivalent framing because the cold was entirely negative for the Wehrmacht. It was a failure of planning, an unexpected enemy, and its psychological weight bore entirely on morale. The psychological research on framing and discomfort that we discussed with the Tibetan monks applies here directly. Soviet soldiers who believed the cold was their weapon experienced it differently from German soldiers who experienced it as defeat. German soldiers' letters home, many of which were intercepted and analyzed by Soviet intelligence and later recovered by historians from postal archives, increasingly described the extreme cold not merely as weather, but in explicit and bitter terms of personal betrayal by their own military and political leadership. Their generals and their Führer had failed to provide adequate winter equipment, had catastrophically failed to plan realistically for a winter campaign on the Russian steppe, and had through a combination of arrogance, incompetence, and institutional negligence abandoned hundreds of thousands of loyal soldiers to freeze slowly to death in a foreign land. Soviet soldiers, despite suffering nearly as much physically, expressed less cold-related despair in their letters because the cultural narrative gave their suffering purpose. They were defending the motherland, and the cold was helping. The long-term health effects on Stalingrad survivors reveal what extreme cold exposure does to the human body when maintained over months. Survivors on both sides of the battle reported experiencing chronic and debilitating cold sensitivity for the entire remainder of their lives, feet and hands, that never fully regained their normal healthy temperature regulation decades after the war ended. The peripheral vascular and nerve damage caused by severe or repeated frostbite episodes being permanent and irreversible, a reminder carried in their own flesh of what they had endured in that single catastrophic winter. Joint problems, chronic pain, and circulatory disorders were epidemic among Stalingrad survivors, the cold leaving a physical signature in the body that persisted for decades after the battle ended. The psychological effects were equally permanent. Many survivors reported that they could never again be truly warm, that something in their relationship with temperature had been permanently altered by the experience. Post-traumatic stress related specifically to cold, distinct from combat-related PTSD, was documented in Stalingrad survivors, triggered by cold weather, the sound of wind, or even the sight of snow. Soviet veterans interviewed in their 70s and 80s described still sleeping with extra blankets, still hoarding warm clothing, still unable to be in a cold room without anxiety. The Stalingrad winter living in their nervous systems, half a century later. There is one more dimension of the Stalingrad cold story that connects it to the broader human experience of cold survival, and it is about what happens when all the systems fail. In every other cold survival culture we've examined, the system works. The Mongolian jur keeps the family warm. The Aboriginal fire camp sustains the sleeper. The Tibetan meditation generates heat. The Bedouin tent blocks the wind. At Stalingrad, the systems failed repeatedly, comprehensively, catastrophically, and what remained was the irreducible human capacity for survival, the thing that exists beneath all technology, all culture, all preparation. Soldiers who survived conditions that should have killed them described a state beyond cold, beyond fear, beyond exhaustion, a pure animal determination to continue existing that they couldn't explain and couldn't have predicted in themselves. This is the most honest truth about cold survival that Stalingrad teaches. Beneath the jur and the tent and the meditation and the fire, beneath every cultural technology for managing cold, there is something in humans that simply refuses to die. Not always successfully, not always enough, but present in every person who has ever faced cold and fought to see the morning. Your heating system tonight works because millions of people across history paid the price of cold with their bodies. The knowledge embedded in your thermostat was purchased with frozen hands and lost toes and nights that never seemed to end. Tonight, in the city that was Stalingrad and is now Volgograd, the temperature may be dropping toward -20 or -30, and the ruins are gone, replaced by apartment blocks with central heating and hot water. But beneath the modern city, somewhere in the frozen soil, there are still fragments of the shelters those soldiers built, the basements they fought for, the dugouts they carved with bayonets, the frozen earth that was the last bed for hundreds of thousands of young men who deserved better. These mysteries have been waiting thousands of years for answers. They'll wait until morning. Sleep well. And when you pull your blanket up tonight, remember that a soldier at Stalingrad would have given everything he owned for that single blanket, and that the warmth you take for granted is something that 2 million people fought and froze and died over in a single winter in a single ruined city on the banks of a frozen river. Sleep well. Good night, and thank you for spending this time with soldiers who endured the coldest battle in modern history, so the rest of us could study what cold really does.